Good evening, everyone, and good day to those of you who are living where it isn't yet evening. My name is Kate Lannon, and I work with the Secretariat for the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. We would all like to welcome you to this side event, to the meeting of the COP to the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions, to this particular side event in which we have in which we share an interest with the World Health Organization. We're very pleased to be co-hosting this event with WHO's Department of Health Promotion and with WHO's Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health. And of course, the topic of tonight's discussion is a very interesting one to us, and we hope it will be to you as well. The topic is tobacco product waste, a threat to the environment. We're very pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Nick Voulvoulis. Nick is a professor of environmental technology at Imperial College London, where he's also deputy director of the Centre for Environmental Policy. He's known as an international expert in environmental management, particularly where science and engineering interface with public policy. And tonight he's going to share with us some thoughts on tobacco's global environmental footprint. Take it away, please, Nick.
Most of the data you have heard so far in the video and the presentation earlier have come from our study. So this is work we have done at Imperial on estimating the global environmental footprint of the whole tobacco industry. The scale of the damage caused by tobacco is to the natural environment and our resources has been largely unknown, although we suspected that it's significant. Some tobacco companies produce sustainability reports and life cycle assessments, but the assumptions and methodologies are not very transparent, and actually what is reported is not the full impact of the whole supply chain. And most of these assessments are limited to manufacturing processes and producers' immediate supply chain, and leave out things like tobacco growing, the curing and distribution, and the end stage of disposing and the end of life of cigarette butts and cigarettes themselves. You can see from tobacco cultivation, tobacco curing, primary processing, the manufacturing of cigarettes, cigarette distribution, and the final smoking use and final disposal. Tobacco's industry supply chain is both global and extensive. To understand the environmental impacts of cigarette smoking, we've done this work, which has been published in the American Journal of Environmental Science and Technology, covering the life cycle impacts of, as I said, the whole global supply chain on an annual basis. To assess the environmental impacts of global tobacco production, we used life cycle assessment and material flow analysis, both internationally recognized tools for evaluating the environmental impacts of complex products and processes. We used available data from the literature as inputs for the models, and also we have some transparent and open assumptions. You can see them in terms of when the data wasn't available. Here you can see the conceptual model of the study for which in every stage of the process, we look at what inputs are in the process and what comes out as waste or as emissions at every stage. And of course, the red ones are some things that we have had to exclude. So even our work underestimates the impact of the tobacco industry. The results here you can see in terms of total annual input, waste and emission flows across the supply chain. The numbers are too small, but at least you can see how we have estimated the inputs and the emissions at every stage of the supply chain, focusing on 1 ton of tobacco and then extrapolating it for the whole global tobacco production. So this is kind of how life cycle assessment works. You get standardized impact results in terms of impact categories. So you can evaluate every part of the process in terms of climate change, in terms of terrestrial acidification, marine eutrophication, human toxicity, urban land occupation, and so on, water depletion, metal depletion. So the amount of resources required are depleted through the whole supply chain, and also emissions from the process, the whole supply chain itself across these stages, and you can add them at the end as a total. So for the 6 trillion cigarette sticks that are produced annually, you can see that 32.4 million tons of green tobacco leaf are cultivated. This happens across 125 countries. The production leads to 6.48 million tons of dry tobacco, which is then manufactured into cigarettes in across 500 factories across the world. You can see the water requirements, land and energy, and also materials that are required as inputs, and also the solid waste, aggregated solid waste, total emissions, carbon emissions, and wastewater. So in terms of carbon emissions, 84 million tons of CO2 equivalents are the emissions from the total supply of the total global tobacco impact, equivalent of emissions of entire countries like Peru or Israel. Water depletion, tobacco requires a lot of water in its cultivation and its curing, so about 22 billion tons of water, again, comparable to what municipal supply of the UK, and 21 million tons of equivalent fossil fuel depleted. This is again equivalent to the total primary energy consumption of a country like New Zealand or Hungary. So you can see that when you add it all up, it's a very significant contribution to both in terms of resources and emissions. Actually, the tobacco competes with other resources. So for land, 5.3 million hectares of fertile land are used to produce tobacco. This is land that otherwise could feed up to 20 million people. So if you look at just the climate change emissions, the carbon emissions from the whole supply chain, you can see here that most of it actually comes from tobacco farming and tobacco curing, the two areas, and this is normally the ones that are not covered by the reports by the industry, which are normally left outside the supply chain. So most of it actually gets underreported. The same thing you can see here. This is the categories I've just described in the life cycle assessment. I'm not sure if you can see the words, but it's the different impact categories. And you can see here that the dominant colors are red and orange, which is again the impacts from farming and from curing, which is again what is most often left out of the reports, the sustainability reports from the tobacco companies, because obviously they're focusing more on the manufacturing and the distribution. The tobacco competes, as I said, with essential commodities, for resources, and places significant pressures on the health of the planet, but also its most vulnerable inhabitants. Almost 90% of tobacco production takes place in developing countries. Actually, the top 10 tobacco producing countries are developing, and 4 of them are actually low-income food deficit countries. So they struggle for food, and that means that land is used for tobacco instead of, for producing food for their peoples. The environmental burden falls, as you can see, in the most vulnerable places on the planet, where people suffer the consequences of growing tobacco. But obviously, the profits come with multinationals in the developed and the higher income countries part of the world. So there is a great injustice in terms of how, let's say, people that smoke in the developed world actually have the impacts in the poorer countries, which end up producing most of the cigarettes. There is the argument that when we challenge what is the real benefit of tobacco smoking, what's the real benefit in terms of this activity, you get the idea that there is income for people in poor economies, that they're producing tobacco and they're making money out of it. But that's really a bit of a myth. Tobacco cultivation requires substantial inputs, so it takes a lot of effort, and which doesn't account in the price that companies are paying for it. Fertilizers, a lot of chemicals in the process. Of course, labor and often children are used in the production. And there's a lot of substantial toxicity in the soil, the land, and the water ecosystems where it's produced. Other crops require fewer inputs, and that's interesting because you can actually see that there's a bit of a myth and propaganda that tobacco is a cash crop. in Zimbabwe, for example, a hectare of land could produce 19 times more potatoes than the 1.1 to 1.2 tons of tobacco that's cultivated there currently. Again, a myth that it gives a lot of income. An average tobacco farmer in Kenya will take about $120 per year after covering all their expenses. And of course, that doesn't include the cost of the labor. So it doesn't really allow much income to even address the food needs or put enough on the table. Now, when you look at it at a personal, at individual level, in terms of a typical cigarette, let's say, that somebody smokes, has shown to have, let's say, a water footprint of about 3.7 liters, a climate change contribution of about 14 grams of CO2, and a fossil fuel depletion of 3.5 grams of oil. It doesn't sound significant, but actually, if you consider that, let's say, an adult who smokes for 20 cigarettes a day for 50 years, which is, I guess, a typical profile of somebody who is a moderate smoker, you can see that these add up to significant values. Okay, so it's interesting to see that even although the global production is the one that demonstrates the significance, even at the personal, at the individual level, when you actually see this, the impacts are comparable to some of other activities. Now, you have to remember that we live at the times where we are facing global challenges and constraints in terms of resource depletion, wasteful and harmful production and consumption, and the emerging impacts of climate change. So I'm sure you know that even governments have started recognizing that we are facing a climate and an environment emergency. The UK and the EU recognized in 2019. And there is a wider acceptance that we need to reduce our carbon emissions and address some of the overconsumption of the planet's limited resources. So while we're facing people, asking people to reduce their travel, change their diets, it makes no sense to let people to smoke when there is really no benefit other than the profits to multinationals from the impacts of cigarette smoking. Now, saying that, I thought I'll use this quote because it's not always fair to refer to individuals. This is not just about individuals having the decision to smoke less or being under pressure to cut smoking. Tobacco, this is a statement that I quite like, just tobacco, alcohol misuse, and obesity, all of these remain intractable problems because of our economic system, because of free-ranging corporations using, promotion, ambiguous distribution, advertising, seductive price strategies to encourage unhealthy consumption, and make it very difficult for people to stop smoking or make it very easy for them to get addicted to these sort of practices. These are all maladies that governments try to prevent mainly by targeting consumers, by targeting individuals, but really a lot of this comes with behaviors, cultures, and institutions, and it's driven by and supported by corporate and government practices. So that's something, again, we need to remember when we're trying to reduce and change people's habits. I guess to close, reducing tobacco consumption is significant at the times of climate emergency. It needs to be identified as a key lever for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly things like the SDG 12, which is responsible production and consumption, SDG 13, which is about climate action, and even 14 and 15, which is about water and land. It is, I think, fascinating that while, despite the enormous profitability, the industry bears a few of the health and environmental costs caused by its products. I think we can all conclude, I hope you will agree with me, it's my conclusion that it's unacceptable that the industry can continue to make billions in profits while washing its hands in greenwashing or not admitting or not paying the costs of the destructive environmental impacts its products deliver. So at that point, I'd like to thank also Maria and Zafiridou and Professor Nick Hopkinson from Imperial, who were part of the team that delivered the study. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, really drawing the curtain back on a lot of very stark and startling figures about the impact that tobacco has on the environment throughout its whole production chain.